The early morning of August 7th, 1914 promised to be hot, and the air above France's eastern border trembled not only from the summer heat, but also from the colossal, almost electric tension that had accumulated there over 43 years of waiting. Along the line dividing two worlds, rows of soldiers stood, their uniforms reminiscent of glorious but long-gone times of Napoleonic victories. The bright red trousers of the French infantry, blue greatcoats, bayonets gleaming in the sun. All this created a picture of frightening beauty, as if at a parade that had, by a fatal mistake, been moved to the field of a coming battle. General Bonneau, commander of the 7th Army Corps, looked through binoculars at the green hills of Alsace, a land that for every Frenchman of that time was not just territory, but a sacred wound on the nation's body. At this moment, history paused, taking a deep breath before leaping into the unknown, and thousands of hearts beat in unison with the order that was about to be given. This was not just the beginning of a military operation. It was an act of national exorcism, an attempt to rewrite the past and, by sheer will, reclaim lost dignity. When the signal for attack sounded, and the first columns crossed the border posts, overturning them into the roadside dust, the air filled with cries of, "Long live France!" Soldiers, many of whom were born after the loss of these lands, stepped onto the soil of Alsace with a sense of religious reverence, believing that the spirit of justice itself made them invulnerable. Local residents ran out of their homes, greeting the liberators with flowers and wine, and in these first hours, it seemed that war was indeed a romantic adventure, where valor inevitably triumphed over calculation. However, behind the euphoria of the first kilometers lay a cold, mathematically precise reality that the French command preferred not to contemplate. They were entering a space that the German General Staff had for decades turned into an ideal trap, where every hill was ranged and every valley could become a pocket for an unwary opponent. To understand the full depth of this drama, one must cast their mind back to 1871, when the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The loss of Alsace and Lorraine became for the Third French Republic not just a territorial loss, but a deep psychological trauma that defined the country's entire domestic and foreign policy for almost half a century. Generations of French children grew up looking at the blacked-out spots on maps in school classrooms and learned from textbooks that instilled a single thought: revenge is inevitable. This idée fixe led to the formation of a specific military doctrine known as French strategists, inspired by the philosophy of vital impulse, convinced themselves and the army that morale was more important than material factors, that the decisiveness of an attack could break any defense, and that the will to win was itself a weapon. Plan 17, developed by General Joffre and his staff, was a direct embodiment of this philosophy. It did not involve complex maneuvering or deep defense. Its essence was reduced to a massive, swift strike directly into the enemy's heart, with the aim of breaking the German center and reclaiming the lost provinces. Alsace was seen as the gateway to Germany, as the empire's soft underbelly, a blow to which was supposed to cause the enemy's immediate collapse. However, the German side, guided by the Schlieffen Plan and its modifications, had a completely different vision of the situation. For them, Alsace was not an objective but a means, a kind of revolving door that was supposed to draw the French army deep inside and then snap the trap shut from the north. German defense here was flexible, designed to let the enemy in, wear them down, and then launch a counterattack when supply lines stretched thin and euphoria gave way to fatigue. When General Bonneau's 7th Corps, approached the city of Altkirk, reality began to make its harsh adjustments to romantic plans. German positions hidden in the forests and on the heights remained silent until the last moment, creating the illusion of no resistance. But as soon as dense French columns, neglecting camouflage, found themselves in the kill zone, they were met with a hail of fire. Here, for the first time, two eras collided. The 19th century with its faith in bayonet charges and the beauty of formation, and the 20th century with its machine guns and rapid-fire artillery. French soldiers, falling into the tall grass, realized with horror that their bright uniforms served as perfect targets, and bravery did not save them from invisible steel flying at the speed of sound. Nevertheless, the force of inertia and numerical superiority allowed the French to take Altkirk. The Germans, true to their tactic of elastic defense, retreated in an organized manner, not allowing themselves to be surrounded and maintaining their combat effectiveness. This tactical victory, which in Paris was perceived as a triumph, was in fact only the beginning of a complex chess game where each move had its price. The occupation of Mulhouse, a major industrial center, became the culmination of the first phase of the offensive. On August 8th, French troops entered the city to the jubilation of the crowd. But General Bonneau, a cautious and experienced man, felt something was amiss. He understood that too easy a success often foreshadowed disaster. His communications were stretched, his flanks exposed, and intelligence reported the concentration of large German forces in the Hart Forest area. At Joffre's headquarters, however, there was an atmosphere close to intoxication with success. Telegrams flying from Paris demanded continued forward movement, ignoring dangers and consolidating a success that on paper looked much more convincing than on the ground. The internal conflict unfolding in General Bonneau's soul was a reflection of the tragedy of the entire French officer corps of that time. On the one hand, he was raised in traditions of unconditional obedience and faith in the offensive impulse. On the other, his eyes and professional intuition told him that he was leading his men into a trap. He saw how the German army, using gray field uniforms, blended with the terrain, while his own regiments glittered against the greenery like targets in a shooting gallery. He ordered defensive positions to be taken around Mulhouse, but the terrain was difficult, and there was no time to create full-fledged fortifications. The soldiers, tired from the march and the heat, began to understand that war was not just parades and flowers, but also exhausting labor, thirst, and the constant expectation of a sudden blow. At this time, on the other side of the front, German General von Haringen coolly prepared a countermove. His army, acting according to clear instructions, experienced no emotional fluctuations regarding _, 0 _. For the German command, it was a task of physics and logistics, to calculate trajectories, ensure the supply of ammunition, and choose the ideal moment for a counterattack. On August 9th, when French troops were still celebrating the liberation of Mulhouse, the German hammer struck them with unexpected force. The attack began at night, which added chaos to the French ranks, unaccustomed to night fighting and poorly oriented in unfamiliar terrain. The German artillery fire was accurate and merciless, turning the defenders' positions into a plowed field where no shelter could be found. Panic, that eternal companion of unexpected defeats, slowly but surely began to engulf the ranks of the French army. Soldiers, who only yesterday were heroes, suddenly felt abandoned to their fate. Communication between units broke down, orders were delayed or contradicted each other. Bonneau, realizing that holding the city threatened complete encirclement, and the loss of the corps, made a difficult but the only correct decision: to retreat. On August 10th, French troops abandoned Mulhouse, a city they had held for only 48 hours. The retreat was difficult. Roads were clogged with refugees fearing reprisals from returning German authorities, carts with wounded and demoralized soldiers. News of the loss of Mulhouse struck Paris like a lightning bolt. The illusion of a quick and easy war crumbled to dust. Joffre, unwilling to admit systemic planning and doctrinal errors, found a scapegoat in General Bonneau. He was accused of a lack of decisiveness, of not understanding the spirit of the offensive, and removed from command. This was the first, but far from the last, sacrifice in the upper echelons of power, offered up on the altar of saving face. However, despite the failure, the strategic machine demanded continued action. France could not afford to stop after the first setback. This would mean admitting the collapse of the entire national idea. A new Alsatian army was formed under the command of General Poe. It included elite Alpine chasseurs, the best units capable of fighting in mountainous terrain. The task remained the same, but the stakes had risen many times over. Now it was not just about regaining territory, but about restoring the army's honor. In mid-August, the second offensive began. This time, the French acted more cautiously, using the features of the Vosges Mountains terrain. The battles shifted to gorges and mountain passes where every stone, every tree became a cover or an obstacle. Here, in the mountains, the war took on a completely different character. If, on the plains, artillery and the maneuver of large masses dominated, then in the Vosges, everything was decided by the resilience of small detachments, the ability to navigate and survive in harsh conditions. The Alpine chasseurs, in their blue berets, clashed with German Jaegers, and this confrontation became legendary. Battles were fought for every peak, for every pass. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the gorges, creating a terrifying cacophony that did not subside day or night. It was here, in the mountains, that the trench warfare that would soon engulf all of Europe began to emerge. But for now, these were only the first, tentative strokes of the future picture of global stagnation. The philosophical conflict underlying these events became increasingly evident. The French concept of élan vital, vital impulse, clashed with the German concept of Materialschlacht, battle of materials. The French believed in spirit, the Germans believed in steel and chemistry. And on the fields of Alsace, steel began to triumph over spirit, however painful it was to admit. Officers leading their men into attack with white gloves and drawn sabers were the first to fall, leaving soldiers without command. This brutal natural selection forced the army to change on the fly, discarding beautiful but useless traditions and learning to survive in mud and under fire. By the 20th of August, the French managed to reoccupy Mulhouse, but the joy from this event was no longer so bright. The city met them warily. The residents, who had experienced 2 changes of power in 2 weeks, were afraid to show emotions, understanding that the situation could change at any moment. And they were right. By this time, the main events began to unfold far to the northwest, in Belgium and northern France, where giant German armies, following the Schlieffen Plan, rolled over the Allies like a tsunami. The Alsatian front, despite all its symbolic importance, was turning into a secondary theater of operations. The German command began transferring reserves to the north, shifting to strategic defense in Alsace. The transformation of the participants' consciousness in the battle occurred precisely at this moment. Soldiers realized that the war would not end by autumn, that a long, cold, and bloody winter lay ahead. The romantic allure finally wore off, revealing the skeleton of war. Dirty trenches, the smell of decay, endless artillery duels, and a constant sense of danger. Heroism ceased to be ostentatious and became quiet, everyday toil. Carrying a wounded comrade out from under fire, delivering ammunition to the front line, simply enduring shelling and not going mad. This became the measure of valor. The culmination of the battles for Alsace in 1914 was the stabilization of the front. After the main forces of both sides were diverted to the Battle of the Marne, a precarious balance was established in Alsace. The front line ran through the peaks of the Vosges, dividing the region into two parts. Some peaks, such as Hartmannswillerkopf, turned into real meat grinders, changing hands dozens of times. This mountain, nicknamed the __0_, became a symbol of the senselessness and brutality of positional warfare. Here, people lived and died in the clouds, among rocks and snow, fighting for scraps of land that had no strategic significance other than symbolic. However, the importance of the battle for Alsace cannot be underestimated. It was here that the French army received its first, albeit bitter, inoculation of reality. The lessons learned from the failures at Mulhouse and in the Vosges Mountains forced the command to revise infantry tactics, begin introducing protective __1_ uniforms, and change the approach to using artillery. The sacrifices made on the fields of Alsace provided time and experience that proved critically important in the decisive Battle of the Marne. German troops, tied up in Alsace by active French operations, could not be transferred north at a critical moment, which possibly played a role in saving Paris. The resonance of these events is still heard today. The battle in Alsace showed how dangerous national myths can be when they replace sober calculation. The desire to reclaim the __2_ at all costs led to huge losses that could have been avoided with a more flexible strategy. This is a lesson that patriotism must go hand in hand with pragmatism, and faith in victory must be supported by material provision and competent planning. For modern Europe, and particularly for relations between France and Germany, these battlefields have become a place of remembrance and reconciliation. Where once bayonets clashed and shells exploded, monuments now stand, reminding us that peace is a fragile value that must be cherished. From the Polish and Russian perspective, the events in Alsace also have their own dimension. The pressure that France exerted on Germany in the West was part of a unified Allied mechanism. Every German corps left in Alsace was a corps that did not end up on the Eastern Front, in East Prussia or Galicia. This was a global interconnectedness, where the fate of a soldier in the Vosges was invisibly linked to the fate of a soldier at Tannenberg or Lviv. War became the first experience of such total connectivity, where the flap of a butterfly's wing in one part of Europe caused a hurricane in another. Concluding the story of this dramatic page of history, our thoughts return to the same border post where it all began. Now it lies aside, forgotten and unnecessary, covered in dust and soot. The border it demarcated has blurred not only on the map, but also in the minds of people. War mixed everything: blood, land, nations. The red trousers of the French infantry have forever passed into history, becoming a museum exhibit, a symbol of a naive era that believed war could be beautiful. In its place came the gray, steel reality of industrial conflict. But it was in this first battle, full of mistakes and hopes, that the spirit of resilience manifested itself, allowing France to withstand 4 years of inhuman trials. Alsace remained a wound, but this wound began to heal, turning into a scar, reminding of the price that must be paid for ambition and freedom. The history of the Battle of Alsace is not just a list of maneuvers and dates. It is a saga of the collapse of illusions and the birth of a new, harsh truth with which humanity had to live throughout the 20th century. Continuing our deep dive into the details of those days, it is important to note the role of specific units and how the psychology of the fighters changed. Take, for example, the 42nd Infantry Regiment, which found itself at the spearhead of the attack near Mulhouse. Its ranks included people from various professions: teachers, peasants, workers. In early August, they marched into battle with songs, confident that they would return home by the grape harvest. In their backpacks were dress uniforms for a ceremonial entry into Berlin. But within a week, these backpacks became an unbearable burden, discarded on the roadside, leaving only the bare essentials: ammunition, water, and hardtack. The letters they wrote home in the early days were full of enthusiastic descriptions of the nature of Alsace and the warm reception from the locals. Letters written at the end of August, if they were written at all, became short, dry, and full of hidden anxiety. They were no longer words of glory, only requests to send warm socks and tobacco. The technical aspect of the battle also deserves close attention. The French 75mm cannon, the famous Mademoiselle 75, was a marvel of engineering for its time. Rapid firing, accurate, it was the ideal weapon for maneuver warfare in open terrain. Artillerymen were proud of their weapon and believed in its omnipotence. However, in the hilly and forested terrain of Alsace, where German howitzers could deliver indirect fire from concealed positions, the direct, flat trajectory of the French cannons often proved ineffective. The Germans, using heavier, larger caliber artillery, could destroy French batteries while remaining invisible. This was a painful discovery. Technological superiority in one component does not guarantee victory if the enemy has a more balanced weapons system. Logistics played no less important a role than tactics. Supplying an advancing army required a huge number of horses and wagons. Railways in the border zone were either destroyed by the retreating Germans or had a different gauge or capacity not designed for French trains. Food and ammunition had to be delivered along narrow mountain roads, which quickly turned into impassable mud under the wheels of thousands of carts. Water became scarce. In the hot August, wells quickly dried up and streams were often contaminated. Dysentery and other diseases began to decimate the army's ranks as effectively as German machine guns. Medical services were unprepared for such a high number of casualties. The evacuation of the wounded became a long and agonizing process, and many who could have been saved in a hospital setting perished in bumpy wagons on their way to the rear. The reaction of the civilian population also deserves special attention. For the residents of Alsace, the arrival of the French army was a complex and ambiguous event. The older generation remembered France and met the soldiers with tears of joy. But there was also a younger generation, raised in German culture, speaking a German dialect and serving in the German army. For them, the situation was a tragic dichotomy. Families found themselves divided by the front line. Brother could shoot brother. The spy mania that gripped both sides made life unbearable for civilians. Any careless glance, any light lit in a window at night, could be interpreted as a signal to the enemy. French counterintelligence viewed locals speaking German with suspicion, and returning Germans cruelly punished those who had helped the French. Alsace became a land where loyalty was a matter of survival, not choice. If one looks at a map of the hostilities of that time, one can see how the front line in Alsace gradually acquired contours that would remain practically unchanged until the end of the war. After the front stabilized, work began on strengthening positions. What began as temporary firing pits for prone shooting was deepened, connected by communication trenches, and reinforced with logs and sandbags. Dugouts and wire entanglements appeared. The Vosges Mountains turned into a fortress. In winter, conditions here became truly extreme. Snowdrifts, avalanches, and frostbite became enemies no less dangerous than the opponent. Soldiers created entire underground cities in the rock, with electricity, ventilation, and even narrow-gauge railways for supplying provisions. Traces of this titanic work can still be found in the forests of Alsace today. Rusty barbed wire embedded in the trunks of ancient trees, moss-covered concrete bunkers, and collapsed trenches. Information warfare was also part of this confrontation. Newspapers in Paris and Berlin painted completely different pictures of what was happening. The French press, subjected to strict censorship, reported only victories, remaining silent about losses and retreats. "Our troops continue their successful advance," headlines read, even when the army was falling back. This created a false sense of security and impending victory for the home front, which later turned into bitter disappointment and distrust of official sources. In Germany, propaganda used the facts of destruction in Alsatian cities as proof of French barbarism, mobilizing the population to defend the homeland. The battle for mines was no less fierce than the battle for territories. The paradox of the situation was that it was precisely the failure in Alsace that saved the French army from complete defeat. If the offensive had developed successfully and French troops had penetrated deep into German territory, they would have found themselves in a pocket, cut off from the main forces, when the German scythe struck through Belgium. The rapid defeat and retreat allowed Joffre to regroup his forces, use the railway network to transfer corps to the west, and create the very fist that stopped the Germans on the Marne. Thus, a tactical defeat turned into a strategic gain, albeit a completely unintentional one. This is one of those lessons of history that teaches us that direct logic does not always work in the chaos of war, and sometimes failure today becomes the key to victory tomorrow. At the individual level, this war broke destinies, but also forged characters. Young lieutenants who survived the first battles quickly matured, becoming tough, pragmatic commanders. They learned to conserve men, not to blindly trust regulations written in peacetime, and to value initiative. It was from this generation of officers that those who would later lead the French army and bring it to victory in 1918 emerged. Alsace became for them a harsh school where exams were passed with blood and retakes were not an option. In the context of international politics, the battle in Alsace served as a signal. For Russia, which had entered the war, France's active operations confirmed its loyalty to its allied obligations. This forced the Russian army to accelerate mobilization and begin an offensive in East Prussia, even without fully completing preparations, in order to ease the burden on its ally. This mutual assistance, paid for at an enormous cost, became the foundation of the Entente. Without the trust forged by joint efforts in August of 14, the coalition could have collapsed in the face of German might. Poland, divided among empires, looked at this conflict with hope, seeing in the clash of giants a chance for the restoration of its statehood. The weakening of Germany and Russia during a protracted war opened a window of opportunity, which Polish patriots ultimately managed to seize. Returning to sensory details, one cannot fail to mention sound. Veterans recalled that the cannonade in the mountains sounded different from that on the plains. The echo repeatedly amplified the roar of explosions, creating the sensation that the sky itself was collapsing. Vibrations from heavy shells caused rock falls, adding a natural danger to the man-made one. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Nights were illuminated by flares, turning the forest into a ghostly, surreal landscape. In this hell, people tried to preserve remnants of humanity. They shared their last piece of bread, wrote poetry, carved crafts from wood or shell casings. Trench art, as it was called, originated precisely during these long hours of waiting between battles. Concluding this extensive overview, we must realize that the Battle of Alsace is not just an episode of the First World War. It is a microcosm of the entire conflict, in which, as in a drop of water, all its contradictions, horrors, and grandeur were reflected. From the naive enthusiasm of the first days to the grim determination of subsequent years, from maneuver warfare to positional stalemate, all this passed through the lands of Alsace. The memory of these events is important not to reopen old wounds, but to understand the mechanics of history, how the ambitions of politicians turn into the suffering of soldiers, how technology changes morality, and how the human spirit is capable of enduring even in the most unbearable conditions. Alsace today is a flourishing region where borders are open and people speak two languages. But beneath the layer of peaceful life lies a deep historical layer, saturated with iron and memory, a layer that will forever remain the foundation of modern Europe.